Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Farr. Welcome to the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkley Center and also director of the Religious Freedom Project. Our goal in the Religious Freedom Project is to focus on an issue that we think does not get sufficient attention, religious freedom, and we think we target for that purpose the academy, the secular media, and the policy world. And so today we're going to have two, and we do this in I think a very broad, in fact I know a very broad way that draws in all of these worlds, and I think you'll see them all represented here today. This morning we're going to talk about an exciting new book which I'll introduce to you in just a second, and its author. And this afternoon, after lunch, brief lunch, we will do focus on a volume of essays focused on religious freedom. And please, for those of you who are not familiar with the Religious Freedom Project, we've put a number of pamphlets outside. You're welcome to take them. If you're not on our mailing list, we invite you to join with us. We'll be doing a number of additional events this fall and in the spring, and we'd love to have you join us for them. Sometimes they're here in this room, often they're on the campus of Georgetown at Copley Formal Lounge, which we've used for many of our events. What you'll see outside are transcripts from a number of the events we've done over the course of the last several months, all of them having to do with religious freedom in one form or another. Okay, I'm very excited to be able to moderate today a discussion of a new book on the history of religion in U.S. foreign policy. I came to the Berkley Center in 2007 after a career in the American Foreign Service, and I spent my first couple of years, and indeed still teach a course on religion in U.S. foreign policy. And one of the first things, and by the way, I've just today met the author, Andrew Preston, of our book for today, so I wish I'd known Andrew was doing what he was doing back in 2007 when I started to look for sources for my course on religion in U.S. foreign policy, and I discovered what he describes in his preface, namely that when he was teaching a course, in his case on the Cold War and the period, I believe, from JFK through Jimmy Carter. It was right during in his case, right after 9/11, and his students were discussing what President Bush was saying about foreign policy, and it seemed to be suffused with religion. And they asked him, "Why is this? Is this typical, or is this some oddity of American history, this particular president?" And Andrew, I think, quite honestly told them, at the time, his impression was, these are my words, not his, that it really is a little bit out of the mainstream of diplomacy. But he said to himself, I really don't know the answer to that question. And this book is a result of a professional historian saying, wait a minute, I ought to know the answer to that question. And all of us who are in this field, alas, too few of us, but all of us who are in this field are grateful to Andrew Preston for writing Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy. So we're going to be talking about that this morning. Andrew will go first. Let me just introduce him briefly. You've got his bio, so I won't say too much about him. And then the two gentlemen who are going to be discussing and responding to the book. First, Andrew is a senior lecturer in history and fellow of Clare College at Cambridge. He's also the author of a book on McGeorge Bunday, and Will Lindboden has something more to say about McGeorge Bunday. It's a very interesting and personal nature. I'll leave that to Will. Andrew's the author of The War Council, McGeorge Bunday, the NSC in Vietnam, and co-editor with Frederick Logoval of Nixon in the World, American Foreign Relations from 1969 to 1977. Let me just give you just a brief overview of a couple of responses that reviewers have made about this book you're going to hear about. Roger Morris, who is a British journalist, writing for the, well, I don't know if he's a journalist or not, he's writing in the Globe and the Mail, said the following: "This is written with a style that further distinguishes Preston in a domain as deficient in literary grace as it is in candor." Amen. Preston excels in portraits of the people at the heart of the matter, from the Puritans to Barack Obama. I'm sure the president would be uncomfortable with that comparison. This is no simplistic case for religion as single cause. Preston's genius is to find the blending with all the other, frequently contradictory strains. Karen Armstrong, who many of you know, History of God and Other Histories, should be required reading for policymakers. Again, amen. And I'm going to do my best to make sure that happens. Mark Knoll, who many of you know, the great historian at Notre Dame, opens up an entire field for much needed further study. I mean, those of you who write books or think about books or read books, which is, I'm sure, most of the people in this room, appreciate when you discover a volume that seems to just open up a field and say, please, you know, enter into it, historians, all of those who have ignored this field in the past. And finally, my colleague Andrew Basevich at Boston University, every now and then a book appears that redefines a field. So Andrew will be followed by Will Inboden, who is assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center for International Security Law at the University of Texas. Will has authored his own terrific book in this field, which I highly recommend. I use both of these in my course, by the way. Religion and American Foreign Policy, 1945 to 1960, subtitle The Soul of Containment. Will is also a scholar on our team here at the Religious Freedom Project. And last but not least, my friend and colleague Scott Flipsy, who's Deputy Director for Policy Research at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And here we touch upon the policy world a bit. Scott has served as the Associate Director and Adjunct Professor for the University of Notre Dame's Washington semester, and in his past life as a staff assistant for Mr. Religious Freedom in the House of Representatives, Frank Wolf of Virginia. So with that, Andrew, please take it over, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for that generous introduction, and it's a real honor to be here. Anyone who works on religious freedom or religious liberty and international affairs, this is one of the places to be. And so to speak here, it's a great honor, and I thank you for having me. And of course, I'm going to thank Will and Scott, not knowing what they're going to say, so I'll thank them now. Get the niceties out of the way. Preemption, exactly, and hopefully strike the first blow. Maybe it's a bit of both. What I'm going to discuss today, I'm going to briefly discuss what my book is about, sort of the general themes of the book, and then I'm going to zero in on a case study that deals specifically with religious liberty, and one that I think has contemporary relevance. I won't be giving policy prescriptions, but I think they're implicit in what I'm going to be saying, and we can make those explicit after my comments. I'd be happy to do that. I'd like to begin by just explaining the purpose of the book, and that is very simply to look at the religious influence on American foreign relations, and I do so over a large sweep of time from the late 16th century, before there was a United States that could even have a foreign policy, up to the very recent past, really up to the present. And the main purpose of the book is to trace the historical evolution of this relationship between American religion and U.S. foreign policy. And it's one that I found, I assumed it was episodic, as Tom alluded to in his opening remarks, and that it wasn't particularly consistent, but I argue, I came to the exact opposite conclusion, that it had a very deep, profound, and fairly consistent influence. I have attempted to trace the roots of this relationship between religion and foreign relations back to the colonial era and carry it through to the present in order to emphasize the continuity of a lot of these themes. Historians are obsessed with change over time, and quite rightly so. That's the main engine that drives historical narratives and historical analysis. But I think that obsession with change over time can also blind us to continuity. And so a lot of the stories that I trace over several centuries in the book do have relevance, continue to have relevance today. And I do argue that the religious influence was consistent. It ebbed and flowed. It wasn't always determining. In fact, quite rarely would I say it was absolutely determining the number one category. But it was always there, and it was always an important factor in the mix in how Americans devised their foreign policy. And one of the themes, and I'm not just highlighting this because I'm here at the Berkley Center, but one of the main themes that I found was the consistency of ideas about religious liberty, and how prevalent they were in American thinking about the wider world, and how prevalent they were in American thinking about how Americans should engage with that wider world, usually to promote religious liberty in other parts of the world. The first 5 chapters of the book deal with the colonial period up to 1791. I look at English Protestant ideas about religion, security, and empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, and then I bring that up to the First Amendment separation of church and state. And I try, and obviously there are entire libraries dedicated to the study of the First Amendment's free exercise and establishment clauses. I don't really want to intervene in those discussions, but I try and apply thinking about the separation of church and state to the practice of foreign policy, and certainly in affecting how Americans viewed the wider world and how they should engage with it. At the other end of the spectrum, the book ends, the last chapter of the book is on Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War, and again it focuses on an episode that is probably familiar to a lot of you, but an episode that dealt with religious liberty, and that was the Siberian Seven, the group of Pentecostals who were holed up in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and the role that episode had in what turned out to be the beginning of the end of the Cold War. So the last chapter deals with Reagan and the Cold War, and then there's a very brief epilogue on George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and I try and place both Bush and Obama in their very different ways within the tradition that I've traced in the book, in the previous chapters of the book. By using such a large sweep, I wanted to give a fuller account of the many diverse and often contradictory ways in which religion helped give shape to America's role in the world. In fact, the central premise of my book is that while religion provided many Americans, not all Americans, but many Americans, with a cultural and ideological lens through which to view the world, a mental map, there was no one single religious influence. And I think this is a mistake that historians make when they look at religion and politics, religion and public life, let alone religion and foreign policy, is that they see it as a kind of as a single influence, rather than this very diverse body of thought and ideas and cultures. And then I argue that through an endless series of debates about America's role in the world, these influences produced a synthesis that pushed U.S. foreign policy in a highly idealistic, moralistic, normative direction. One of my research questions was why, that's one of the most common things. I'm based in Britain, and one of the most common perceptions of U.S. foreign policy, or one of the most common questions is, why is it so principled? Why is it pursuing ideals all the time? Why is it prioritizing normative goals and values-driven goals? And the answer that I came up with in the book, a large part of the answer is the role that religion has played in U.S. foreign policy. For this reason, the book is entitled Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, as Tom said. And that comes from the cobbling together of 2 phrases in the epistle to the Ephesians, in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. He didn't have those 2 phrases side by side as I've put them. They're in different verses. But I've put them together because they perfectly capture the book's core argument. And also, quite a few American foreign policymakers themselves have used these verses from Ephesians, including Woodrow Wilson and John Foster Dulles. But these 2 phrases, sword of the Spirit, shield of faith, do convey the book's core argument that the religious influence has made American foreign relations unusually normative, idealistic, and values-driven, both in terms of war, the sword of the Spirit, and in terms of peace, the shield of faith. In terms of conservatism and liberalism, nationalism and internationalism, militarism and pacifism, exceptionalism and cosmopolitanism. So the religious influence was never unidirectional or consensual or static or monolithic. I have 2 main approaches in the book in tracing the religious influence. I have a top-down approach where I look at elite policymakers, especially religious policymakers who themselves were religious, and how they applied their own religious values and ideas to the conduct of foreign policy. And I also take an an approach that's more unusual to the study of foreign policy. Certainly it's fairly new to diplomatic historians over the last 15 or 20 years, but I take a bottom-up, more social and cultural approach where I look at ordinary Americans who didn't wield policy-making authority and how and their efforts at either lobbying the government or lobbying their representatives or creating a broad-based movement to call for U.S. foreign policymakers to do certain things. And the sort of narrative and analytical engine of the book looks at these negotiations, for lack of a better word, between elite policymakers and religious Americans who are tireless and who are very idealistically driven and who are committed to foreign affairs issues. I argue in the book more so than other Americans. They had an interest in foreign relations that was much stronger than that of Americans who weren't necessarily religious. And these ordinary Americans were constantly pushing the policymakers. And so the narrative engine of the book looks at the interactions between policymakers and this bottom-up social more bottom-up social influence. And that's the example I'm going to come to now, or rather that's the approach I'd like to discuss in a few minutes now in a bit more detail. That's an historical example, but as I said, has some real contemporary relevance. Quite a few presidents in American history have put religious liberty at the very center of their foreign policy. That's not to say that it eclipsed everything else or that it overrode the national interest or it trumped the national interest in any sense. But quite a few presidents made religious liberty issues, or put them rather at the heart of their foreign policy. Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, who we don't normally think of as a particularly religious president, but I argue in the book was probably the president who had the most success in applying religion to his foreign policy. So we have Wilson, FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, those sorts of presidents, and the stories around them, some of the stories we know, some of the stories we don't know. I'd be happy to talk about them in the Q&A. But in the 10 minutes or so I have left, I'd like to outline one example in particular of this more bottom-up social influence of ordinary Americans and how they promoted religious liberty abroad, and then through their efforts to promote religious liberty abroad, pulled the State Department and other branches of the government along with them to promote a sort of values-driven normative agenda to promote liberties abroad. And this example that I'd like to discuss is that of Protestant missionaries in late 19th and early 20th century America. Non-missions historians, so historians who don't specialize in looking at missionaries or missions, have, especially diplomatic historians, have almost unanimously portrayed 19th and 20th century missionaries as hardcore imperialists, as the tip of the imperial spear, as people who advanced the American imperial or economic agenda in China or the Philippines or a lot of other places in the world. That they were aggressive agents of political and military imperialism. At the very least, they were aggressive agents, this is as historians say, or this is what historians say, at the very least they were aggressive agents of cultural imperialism. And in some sense this is true. There were of course missionaries who were hardcore imperialists, who did want to advance some sort of agenda for American power or to entrench American power in the Middle East or China or lots of other places. But once I got into the actual missionary records, once I moved beyond the secondary literature and got into missionary records, I was stunned to find that those hardcore missionary imperialists were actually the exception to the rule. I was really surprised to find that missionaries were often the bitterest critics of, say, the American role in the Philippines over a century ago, or what the United States was doing in China. They protested the sort of importation of social ills that they thought American soldiers were bringing to places like the Philippines, prostitution, gambling, alcoholism, that sort of thing. So part of their agenda was to mount the same kind of reform initiative in a place like the Philippines that they were already, that their counterparts were doing back in the United States. But they were also, more surprisingly, they were they were critics of the idea of an American empire, or even the idea of the United States having some sort of dominant or domineering role in these countries. A lot of times, these missionaries took the perspective of the locals, of the Chinese, or of the Filipinos, or the Koreans, or whoever, and they encouraged nationalist agendas. They encouraged nationalism, and I'll come back to that theme in a second. Missionaries certainly were cultural imperialists from the 19th century on, and I would say missionaries today practice a kind of cultural imperialism to this day. But they practiced a kind of informal, often inadvertent imperialism of introducing and then spreading a universal value. And I put universal in quotation marks not because I don't believe in universal values, but because they were spreading values that they said were universal, but that people in these countries, in China or the Philippines or wherever, had never heard of. And so that's why I think I sort of couch universal in these inverted commas, that they're spreading universal values that upon peoples who had never heard of these universal values, let alone the applicability of universal values. Common examples are the China missionaries, who have such a terrible reputation. And yet when we look at what the China missionaries did in the late 19th century, their emphasis wasn't, the emphasis of most of them wasn't on conversions or spreading the gospel, although they of course did that, but it was on what we would now call development work. It was building schools, building medical clinics, helping dig irrigation ditches, and so on and so forth. They were particularly concerned with spreading rights to girls and women. If you read the literature for China missionaries in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that was their main concern. It wasn't just building schools, it was building schools for girls, because boys could get an education, but girls couldn't. And their big crusades were things like anti-foot binding crusades and anti-opium crusades. And they were very critical of the US and British governments for their role in spreading the opium trade in China. They weren't just sort of aping an official line that was handed down from Washington or that they were getting from London, which was a fairly brave thing to do, given that they relied on Washington and London ultimately for protection. But they were fierce critics of US and British policy. Missionaries were cultural imperialists in doing so, even with something that we would all regard as abhorrent, like foot binding, because they were coming in attacking practices that were centuries old, attacking practices like foot binding in the name of a universal value. And as they did so, they were attracting a lot of local anger. They provoked an intense amount of local anger. And through the 1890s, right up to the Boxer Rebellion, which was in large part an anti-missionary rebellion, not just an anti-Western rebellion. But through the 1890s, there were constant riots and constant attacks on missionaries and missionary property in China. And when these attacks happened, the missionaries were then put in the uncomfortable position of then having to turn to U.S. naval forces or British soldiers for protection. I'd like briefly to talk about two other examples. The story of the China missionaries is fairly well known, but I'd like to just mention two other examples that I think are well, I know that they're lesser known and also fairly interesting. One has a certain topicality because it deals with Mormons, and so it has a topicality in this election season. And I found this story looking through some diplomatic records, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't been told in other historical accounts. Mormon missionaries, back then as they do today, would go on, every Mormon would be a missionary and would go to places like Europe to try and spread the Mormon faith. And as they did so, they found themselves persecuted for simply proselytizing and for preaching their faith. And they were persecuted in France, in Germany, in Norway, in Spain, in Italy, basically all over Europe, with the important exception of Great Britain, where they were basically left alone and allowed to do whatever they want, as long as they didn't break local law. And these Mormons, when they got in trouble in France or Germany, or importantly in a lot of European colonies, in French Tahiti or in the German African colonies, they did what any American would do if they get into trouble when they're abroad, and they turned to their embassy or their consulate and said, "I've just been arrested for X, Y, or Z, and I need help." And at first, the diplomats wanted to have nothing to do with these Mormon missionaries. They didn't like Mormonism, what they knew of it. They didn't like missionaries, and of course, you combine the two, Mormon missionaries. These people were anathema to the diplomats, and yet it was clear that these Mormon missionaries were getting picked up for simply preaching their faith. They weren't getting picked up for breaking local law. So the diplomats in the first case was in French Tahiti, actually, and then it spread. It spread to, or it provided a precedent for what was going on in Europe. The local diplomat or consul would write back to the State Department and say, "What do we do with these people? Because they haven't broken local law, but they are being persecuted. They're American citizens. Do we protect them? Do we not protect them?" And John Hay, who was Secretary of State at the time, conferred with people in Washington, and then eventually wrote back a very strong directive that if Mormon missionaries weren't breaking local laws that would be considered just laws in the United States, like about theft or assault or something like that, if all they were doing was preaching their faith, then they deserved the full protection of the U.S. government. And the U.S. government then brought a lot of pressure to bear on not the British, but on the Norwegian and the French and German governments to basically allow these Mormons to preach their faith. Now, a lot of these countries had official established churches that did not recognize missionary efforts in their countries. They didn't recognize the legitimacy of coming in and preaching what was an alien faith and trying to convert people away from the official church. But in all of these cases, these foreign governments backed down. And they did so because the U.S. government, not because it wanted to, but because the missionaries were basically putting the issue on the spot and making the U.S. government follow them. The U.S. government was basically changing local law in other parts of the world in the name of a universal value such as religious liberty. There's a very similar story of Methodist missionaries in South America who were also persecuted. They were attacked much more violently than Mormon missionaries had been in Europe. And again, the State Department came down very strongly on the side of these Methodist missionaries and actually forced a change where there were official established Catholic churches, and forced a change in the law in places like Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador. Now, this is certainly a form of cultural imperialism. These are outsiders coming in and spreading outside values, in this case religious liberty, at the expense of local traditions and customs. I don't like, but it's a kind we easily recognize today in the activities of human rights NGOs. These are outsiders coming in, spreading their values, and yet this is exactly what human rights organizations do today, and I would think that most of us, hopefully all of us in this room, would agree that these sorts of efforts and these sorts of initiatives are perfectly valid and are in fact quite necessary to spread these universal values. It's why I don't really like the term cultural imperialism, and I don't use it in the book, and I follow some historians of missions who prefer the term cultural exchange or cultural transfer. And a lot of cultural historians now prefer that the term cultural imperialism is being sort of sort of moved to the sidelines and relegated as a relic of the 1970s or 80s when these issues were a lot more heated. And so I see this really as an episode in cultural transfer or cultural exchange. I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Will and Scott and see what they think. But perhaps we could just continue this discussion after in the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's great to be here with everyone and see some familiar faces and some new ones as well. First, back to Tom's cryptic allusion about McGeorge Bundy and me, and Andrew's first book being on McGeorge Bundy. At my faculty position at the University of Texas is supported in part by the Walt Rostow Chair. And many of you may know that Walt Rostow was Mac Bundy's deputy and then successor as National Security Advisor in the Kennedy and Johnson administration. And one of the privileges of being supported by the Rostow Chair is the Rostow family has kept Walt Rostow's collection of ties. And the tie I'm wearing today is actually one of Walt Rostow's old ties. This tie is older than I am. But I don't know what it says about the cycles of fashion. I don't think it's terribly out of style. I mean, did you? I hope you're not repelled by it. Anyway, so it's in honor of the Walt Rostow chair that I'm, so anyway, wearing this today. The other brief biographical note, and I shared this with some colleagues at the University of Texas yesterday, when I was starting work on the project that became my first book, which Tom alluded to, on religion and American foreign policy, just in a narrow window of the early Cold War years, I remember thinking, there's something to this religion and foreign policy angle. I'm just looking at these, 15 years from 45 to 60. Somebody out there really needs to write the great book on 400 years of this in American foreign policy. It's not me. I had, didn't have the wherewithal to do it. And it was around that time that I met Andrew and learned that he was working on just such a project. So I've had the privilege of being sort of a friendly observer and supporter for the last several years as he worked on this, and it's wonderful to see it come to fruition. So turning now to my more formal comments in the book. So pre-revolutionary 18th century France and the 20th century Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin would appear at first glance to have very little in common. But in the narrative of Andrew Preston's path-breaking new synthesis of American religious and diplomatic history, both nations stand as exemplars of the peculiar foreign policy compromises that religious Americans have had to make. For both regimes were seen in their day as repellent, whether Protestant disdain for the purported theocracy of French Catholicism, or the revulsion felt by virtually all Americans towards the USSR's atheistic communism and persecution of religious believers. So in the case of the former, Preston observes of colonial Americans that, quote, France represented the tyranny of superstition and ignorance. How could the enlightened, godly people of America put their fate in Catholic hands? Almost 2 centuries later, in Andrew's description, the Soviet Union posed a similar dilemma to anxious Americans. Quote, liberals and conservatives, Protestants and Catholics were divided by much, but they were nearly united by a moral unease at allying so closely with Stalin. Yet at these and other pivotal junctures in American history, the needs of geopolitics made both nations indispensable allies for American national security and even the fate of the free world. Without the alliance with France, the American Revolution will almost certainly not have succeeded, and we'd be speaking British today, right? Okay, so, all right. And absent the United States' partnership with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, the Second World War would have turned out much differently. So such tensions and trade-offs between strategic necessity and spiritual purity are some of the many paradoxes that emerge from Andrew's excellent book. Now, multiple endorsers, and Tom read some of them, have described this book as landmark, and in a historiographical sense, that is a suitable description. It's simply and strangely, given the prominence of religion in shaping America's role in the world, the first book of its kind to be written. And while Andrew would not even claim to offer the last word on the subject, he sets the standard that will shape much future scholarship. Until this past decade, historians of American religion and historians of American foreign relations have generally operated in different intellectual realms and have had little, if anything, to say to each other, an unfamiliarity that goes back generations. But Andrew's book has changed all that. And he's done so first with a voluminous amount of research, mining extensive archives and surveying a remarkable breadth of secondary literature. Even those who don't find his interpretations persuasive, and I'm not among them, will find his bibliography and footnotes indispensable resources for further study. And he also, and I hope you pick this up even in his careful remarks here, I think he deftly and sensitively handles a mixture of topics that by themselves can be controversial. Religion, foreign policy, imperialism, missionaries, et al. But taken together, these things can be combustible. That's certainly not the normal fare of polite dinner party conversation. And yet I think Andrew largely avoids the partisanship and distortion and self-righteousness that too often bedevil less fair-minded scholars from any number of vantage points. And moreover, considered from a broader angle, as I read the book, it struck me this is actually essentially a survey of American history itself. And I think that it shows us that you cannot understand the last 400 years of this nation's history without religion and without foreign policy by themselves, and especially in how they interact together. Yet if religion has been a near constant influence on America's role in the broader world, it has by no means been univocal. This will be all too familiar to those who already know the diversity and divergent opinions that religious actors have brought to American domestic politics. But in foreign policy, American Protestantism alone, without even considering Catholicism and Judaism or some of the other flavors of American religion, Protestantism alone has been as discordant as it has been vociferous. It has supported war and protested for peace. It's been isolationist and interventionist. It's been expansionist and anti-imperialist. It's been nationalist and internationalist. At times in the same historical moment, and at times even within the same denomination or theological tradition. And if liberal and conservative Protestants have had their own internal differences over foreign policy across American history, the eventual involvement of other groups such as Catholics, Jews, and Mormons brought even more diversity of voice and values. Attempting to draw out some continuities amidst this historical cacophony of religious opinion, Preston traces some recurring themes and core features across centuries of American religion and foreign relation, specifically morality, liberty, progress, and nationalism. And as generic as these themes are, Andrew identifies many particular manifestations, such as providentialism and mission, the trope of crusade against enemies, millennialism, the role of religious communities acting as the conscience of the nation, and the contributions that religion played in shaping American exceptionalism. So even accounting for the sprawling diversity of religious influences over 4 centuries of American history, one interpretive shortcoming in this otherwise magisterial book, and again, this wouldn't be a discussion if I didn't point out at least a few quibbles, comes in its, I think, insufficient development of certain ideas. Now, let me say right there that this is in some ways horribly unfair of me to do. The guy has written a 700-page book. I mean, it's already very long. Anytime you point out certain omissions, that is almost a cheap shot that we scholars can do to each other. So mea culpa. But that said, choices have to be made. And sometimes when Andrew would toss out a certain theme, I'd want to see a little bit more of it there, even if it meant making it 702 pages. So I'll just mention a couple of those. So for example, in his chapter on the American Revolution, Andrew correctly observes that, quote, by fusing their revolutionary objectives with the common fires of faith, the founders created 3 principles that would have a lasting impact upon the conduct of U.S. foreign policy: unilateralism, republicanism, and separationism. But not enough is said in subsequent chapters about unilateralism in particular, even though an aversion to, quote, entangling alliances and a preference for unfettered freedom of action did much to shape subsequent American foreign policy over the ensuing centuries up to the present day. So the suggestion that religion shaped this American tradition is intriguing, and I would have liked to have seen it explored further. Now, the book gives somewhat more attention to republicanism as an enduring principle, which Andrew describes as the American belief, quote, that a state's internal character influenced its external behavior. If Americans could not feel safe in a world without Republican virtue, the solution was obvious: spread the virtue and its attendant blessings of liberty, which to many Americans also meant the spread of Christianity. And again, this insight about the internal character of a regime being determinative in its external actions and therefore of interest to American foreign policy absolutely resonated. I mean, during my time working with Tom at the State Department and then at the National Security Council, this was one of the strategic assumptions in American foreign policy that has continued across administrations. So I was fascinated to see some of the early religious antecedents of this. Now, the third theme of separationism is the one that Andrew develops most fully, even going back to his remarks earlier, and it's a signal contribution. Now, I'd say the term separationism itself is problematic. I think disestablishment would be more precise. I'll let our constitutional lawyers here take that up maybe in the next panel. But by it, Andrew refers to the separation of ecclesial from political power, thus religious liberty. And the primacy and persistence of religious liberty, not just as an American constitutional lodestar, but also as a foreign policy principle, has never before been explored in the nuance and depth that Preston does here. He argues that from the nativity of American identity, quote, religious liberty became intimately bound with the American critique of concentrated arbitrary power and a rallying cry in the centuries to come. It usually helped Americans define who were their friends in the world and who were their foes, end quote. From there, he traces the remarkably consistent concern of the U.S. to promote religious liberty across the globe and across the centuries. Religious liberty was really seen by many American leaders as inseparable from religious practice. So the examples are diverse and abundant. They include calls for humanitarian intervention to spare Greek Christians from Ottoman depredations in the 1820s, unprecedented diplomatic efforts to protect Russian and Romanian Jews from pogroms later in the 19th century, Woodrow Wilson's inclusion of religious liberty as a core principle in his failed vision of a new international order. Or maybe I shouldn't say failed, but maybe just stillborn and later rebirthed under FDR. FDR's impassioned appeals to Stalin to end religious persecution in the Soviet Union, mainline Protestantism's successful effort to include religious freedom as a foundational principle at the birth of the UN, American efforts throughout the Cold War to promote religious freedom behind the Iron Curtain and even within the borders of American allies, and then most recently the 1998 passage of the International Religious Freedom Act. And moreover, and I was especially intrigued by this, Andrew observes how during those rare moments, rare within the context of 400 years of history, when the American government abandoned the principle of religious freedom, whether it's complicity as a supporter of the religious persecution of Vietnamese Buddhists in the 1960s, or Kissinger's opposition to the campaign for Soviet Jewry as an impediment to his détente policy, problems inevitably followed in both the foreign and the domestic policy context. So for those here who have normative commitments to religious liberty as a current policy issue, I think you'll find some tremendous resources and insights in Andrew's book. There's nothing new under the sun. So there's much more that could be said, and I'm sure Scott will say it better than I have. But these, slight quibbles about things that weren't developed fully should not be in any way a detraction for what I really think is a landmark book. Moreover, it offers a rich and previously unmined motherlode of insight and material on this subject of religious liberty. And as Andrew shows, I think religious liberty really is inseparable from much of the American identity itself. So, thank you.
When Tom emailed me and asked me to do this, it was 2 weeks ago exactly, and I said, fine, how hard could it be to read a book, and to sort of make some comments, and I received it 8 days ago and didn't realize that it was the size of War and Peace with an extra chapter on war. But I have to say that, I got caught up in the narrative. I think it is remarkably readable. It is remarkably, sort of compelling, I think, in the simple thesis that it puts forward about religious influence in shaping the way that America does war and diplomacy. And I liked it enough to recommend it to the sort of new module at the Foreign Service Institute on religious freedom, or religion and foreign policy, because I think it should be required reading for sort of emerging diplomats to know the story of religion's salience, but also to look at the way that religious freedom and religious liberty is something that isn't a new ideal, something that is, for many of them, a nuisance to other issues of foreign policy, but is something that is there at the creation of the Republic and as part of the consensus of American virtue and exceptionalism. But what I liked particularly about, sort of what Andrew raised, or some of the sources that he brought up in terms of religious liberty, is that he understands it, or the sort of Americans that he writes about understood religious freedom as a national security issue, not only in terms of the way that the revolutionary sort of generation understood themselves as opposed to Catholics in Canada or Native Americans on the frontier, but in the vignettes on Wilson and particularly FDR, sort of understanding sort of the fundamental nature of religious freedom and its impact on, both not only human rights, but on America's sort of interests in the rest of the world. I'm not an academic anymore, so, I'm going to tell a couple sort of stories and maybe go to some, sort of larger sort of quibbles, as it were. If anyone in this room, and I don't know if there is anyone, is not convinced that religion has played an influence in American foreign policy, one has to only go to a month ago to sort of two sort of very interesting sort of speeches, one given by Aung San Suu Kyi here at the sort of U.S. Institute of Peace, and the other by Benjamin Netanyahu at the UN. which, I mean, I was sitting at the speech for Aung San Suu Kyi, and she, in the opening, talked about this special relationship between Burma and the U.S. as deriving from the American missionary experience in Burma, which in her experience was culturally sensitive, was focused not on imperialism or on changing the natives, had sort of brought Christianity to the ethnic minorities in a way that bettered their life. And I was sitting in front of a couple sort of State Department officials, and they were looking at each other going, what is she doing? What is she talking about? And so I immediately texted someone from Judson College, who I knew, sort of it's named after the first American missionary there, and I said, you need to sort of invite Aung San Suu Kyi to your college immediately, because, you know, as a sense, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi, even though she's been in prison for a while, understands sort of the notion and was appealing to an audience which she thought was, you know, sort of influenced by religion, and that special relationship was going to be built on that history. Also, you know, in the UN, Benjamin Netanyahu, I think very clearly, though he knows America and the audiences to which he spoke, used very clear biblical references and biblical stories to sort of talk about the Jewish experience and the threat that Judaism, or that the Jewish state was under, which I think goes over the heads of particularly diplomats to sort of those American audiences which are supportive of Israel, very clearly, not just about Judaism itself, but also you know, sort of biblical stories of Hezekiah and Nehemiah, which he named sort of very specifically. I mean, I think, as Andrew said, when you get to the end of the book, there's a very simple statement, which I think is sort of a general thesis. He says, there continues to be a religious influence on American foreign relations, whether for war or for peace. Religion remains an integral part of foreign relations. Those who conduct U.S. foreign policy ignore it at their peril. I think if you get to the end of this book, if you do actually make it through, I think you will be convinced of this fact, because I think he skillfully weaves what I think is what is U.S. Protestant history, basically, with sort of U.S. diplomatic and political history. And as I said, I enjoyed it so much that I've you know, sort of recommended it to sort of for our diplomats to read. But at the same time, and there may be others here who have these questions, I'm an obvious audience for this book, not just because of my graduate school work, which is on, you know, sort of religious NGOs in Vietnam, but also because of my upbringing in a Dutch Reform subculture, where developing a worldview, a Christian worldview, as it were, was kind of like mother's milk. It was something that we were expected to do, to develop a Christian grand strategy, as it were, not only for character formation, but to think about ways that our faith could improve and even reform human activity, any human activity or profession. And there's an idealistic strain there, which I think still remains in me. I even earned a worldview badge in the Dutch Reformed version of the Boy Scouts, which is called the Cadets, or a shortened version of Calvinist Cadet Corps, which seems militaristic and probably not something that John Calvin would have, you know, sort of approved of. But also, and this is in the 70s, my great-grandmother was a missionary to China. And if you asked me in those days who lost China, I would have said Pearl Buck. Pearl Buck lost China. It wasn't, sort of, Harry Truman. It was Pearl Buck. My cousin went to Laos to work for Heifer International in the 50s, and I think he came back and convinced us all that economic development programs were not only a missionary activity, but a great way to spread American values and help defeat the communists. He later became a CIA agent, sort of maybe validating that notion of sort of missionaries eventually sort of becoming part of the American imperial experience in Southeast Asia. But he went as a missionary. And my view of race and racial issues came from my eager interaction with a steady stream of Ugandan and Ethiopian pastors and American gospel singers who came through my parents' home. So I don't know. I mean, I thought that this was the way of the world, and maybe this is a way that's disappearing. But certainly Andrew convinces me in both the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach that he takes that this is something that was normative, I think, in the American experience, and how Americans, not only at the elite level but at the popular level, developed their views of the world and tried to integrate them in an idealistic strain into the American experience. So, I mean, you can count me sort of in the amen corner for sort of Andrew's thesis that religion plays a salient role in shaping sort of worldviews of presidents, policymakers, pastors, and through most of American history, and was, I think this is a secret ingredient. This is I think he used that word, a secret ingredient in the way that U.S. foreign policy was shaped. And while, I mean, again, these are my quibbles, I guess, and it's going to be a little bit, so I'll develop them. I think while the book easily identifies sort of a shared religious vocabulary and rhetoric used to justify and critique U.S. war and diplomacy, and I think it shows very clearly the ways that religious actors played behind the scenes in a lot of major sort of foreign policy decisions, I think it's more difficult to identify, and I'm sure you heard this before, how religion affected the substance of foreign policy decisions. Not that it wasn't there, but at what point, and particularly at what point did religious ideals and religious influence override other interests when they were at stake, particularly in areas of war? And I'd like to hear, and I've always got this in my sort of graduate school seminars, this question, and I'd like to hear how Andrew has answered that question, of how religious arguments and coalitions overrode other interests, particularly in issues of war, but in other areas. And I'd like him to stay away from the issue of religious liberty, because I mean that one, I think is an easier sort of approach and is shot through the book. But where has these things made a difference in the substance of foreign policy making? Of course, as he says at the beginning, the proof of this is not really the point. And religion does not provide, as he says, a unified theory, but is a missing element. And I think he provides very clearly how that missing element has sort of been interjected through different sort of elements, through vignettes of presidents and of missionaries and of organizations, and providing, I think, us with a richer understanding of America's role in the world. As he said, I think the strength of this book is from a very boring historiographical choice, stressing continuity as opposed to conflict or change. And I think he does that very well. And I tried to puzzle through this about what it is that was continuous, and how this is transmitted in your narrative. And to me, and I might be wrong, but this is something to discuss, I think that continuity is formed around the shared ideal of American exceptionalism. America was exceptional not only because it was different, but better. And it was often better because it was different. And because of these differences, because it was pluralistic, or at least purported to be, America is or should be a unique force for good in the world because it has unique virtues: religious liberty, freedom of speech, other civil and political rights, democracy, that were developed in a crucible of liberty. And as such, America has a duty to spread this virtue, or at least share it with the rest of the world. And this mission to spread American virtue of liberty has led to both conflict and war, and efforts of domestic reform, isolationism, pacifism. But to me, that is the consensus. That's what is sort of shared by most policymakers, pastors, religious leaders, individuals, people in the pews, people in the Oval Office for centuries. This consensus, I think, as he shows in some of the chapters at the end, starts to break down. Starting in the 50s and accelerating in the 60s and 70s, coinciding with the decline of Protestant establishment and the emergence of Jews, Catholics, and to a certain extent neo-evangelicals, from the margins of U.S. life and thought. So I think this is the weakest part of the book, in a sense, because, maybe not the weakest, I'd say less confident part of the book, where in the 19th and 20th century, the fights were about what means should be employed to spread America's mission and unique virtue. But in the 60s, Protestant groups in particular, joined by sort of African American pastors and also Catholics, some Catholics, were asking whether America's mission was sinful or imperialistic or hegemonic. In part, I think this came from a moral critique from the periphery or the global South, and as a product, I think, as he points out, of the predominance of issues of race, development, particularly modernization theory, and détente among elite leaders. The stain of segregation, the acceptance of modernization theory, and its posit of secularization as a needed goal for the development of societies, and the eventual triumph, I believe, in Kissinger and Nixon of continental realism as the dominant academic theory in international relations, all led to this breaking up of this consensus. And that leads, I think, to sort of a less confident sort of narrative that comes towards the end of the book. Doesn't mean there isn't continuity. It just means that it is diffuse, and it gets diffused into Jews and Catholics and neo-evangelicals. And my quibble here is that the book doesn't do a good job of, or not a convincing job, of delineating for me why Jews would join the consensus of American exceptionalism, even though you say they brought human rights into the sort of center of sort of American foreign policy, and there was a moral critique stemming from the Holocaust, but it's a bland and one-dimensional sort of a couple pages that you devote to it. Similarly, there isn't a convincing argument in my mind of how the new right, or at least this consensus that develops in the 70s and into the 80s that became part of the Reagan coalition and forward, how Protestants in general gave up their sort of distrust of both Jews and Catholics, and moved towards sort of cooperation, intimate cooperation on many issues, over the period. I do think that that some Protestant evangelicals and some fundamentalist Protestants and segments of a diverse coalition of what we now call the New Right, including some Jews, Catholics, and Mormons, emerged to keep alive the ideal of America's global mission. I think the cultural power, the moral vocabulary of this ideal is not as strong, is not as widely shared as it was during the centuries of the Protestant establishment, and therefore doesn't make it all the way to elite circles in the way that it did in World War II, World War I, and in the immediate Cold War. And I don't think that's a bad thing, frankly, personally. And I think that the fragmenting sort of meta-narrative of American exceptionalism, I think, has led to a flourishing of ecumenical interest-based coalitions to advance individual civil and political rights, which has focused political efforts to pass legislation like IRFA or the Trafficking in Persons Act against elite opinion, which has placed countries like Sudan on the list of U.S. priorities. I mean, does anyone here think that there would be a country of South Sudan right now without the coalition of evangelicals and Catholics and Hollywood types who have, made Sudan sort of a priority in some respects, to engage faith-based actors in addressing issues of poverty and development, and also, I think, as sort of an outgrowth of the breakup of the consensus. Eventually, I think there is common people in this room who I admire, like Tom and Will and others, who have become part of what is a flourishing, empirically based sort of effort to provide evidence that demonstrates that religious liberty is crucial to the thriving of societies and to peace. And in sort of the sort of World Bank social capital reports and the Tony Blair project at Yale, to look at how religious actors and communities are critical to the success of global health and economic development. I think that this is an outgrowth maybe of, and I haven't really thought this through yet, but a turning on its head of modernization theory in some respect. And particularly the secularization of modernization theory, particularly in the areas of economic development and health. So in conclusion, the influence of religious actors may be more diffuse than in the past. The activities of religious coalitions may be more episodic, interest-based, and even partisan. And I think there will remain serious doubters about the worth of American exceptionalism. But I think maybe this is the idealistic side of me coming again from my cadet days. I think we're approaching a time when I think it will be recognized widely in foreign policy circles that humans are spiritual creatures who thrive best when they enjoy freedom to express their fundamental dignity, and that religion itself and the promotion of religious freedom as a foreign policy interest will be viewed by strategists and opinion makers not only as a secret ingredient or as a missing element in the pursuit of American war or the support of American war or peace, but as an interest fundamentally tied to the success of other global interests in prosperity, education, stability, and security. So I want to thank Andrew for the book. I think it's fantastic. I do think that it opens up for other graduate students and other scholars a lot of avenues to flesh out some of its chapters, and to be here with both Tom and Will, who I admire greatly. Actually, Will and I, this is kind of like getting the band together. Huh? Will and I, in 2001, when we were fellows, he was at AEI and I was at Brookings, put together a conference called The Soul of American Foreign Policy. Which is I think Tom may have been there. It was sort of our first attempt to sort of look at this issue that both of us were interested in, I think has, flowered in the Berkley Center and some of this research that's going on now. So, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I think that was taken together a masterful blend of the intellectual and the policy worlds of the kind that we love to have here in the Religious Freedom Project. I'm going to give Andrew an opportunity here to respond to some of the thoughts that Will and Scott have given him, and then I want to save some time to turn to the audience. So I had a couple of things I wanted to say. I'll keep this very brief, though, so we'll have plenty of time. Scott ended on a very hopeful note about policymakers paying attention to religion. I'm sure he would agree with me, and I know Will would, that we're not there yet. And I was struck by the story of the American diplomats listening to Aung San Suu Kyi praise American proselytism, if you like. Not quite in those words, but praising the results of American missionaries in Burma, and the diplomats looking at each other saying, what in the dickens is she talking about? And going back to Andrew's story of the American diplomats in, I don't know whether it was Tahiti or wherever it was in the 19th century, doing the same thing when they were faced with Mormon missionaries causing trouble on their doorstep. Some things haven't changed. I think American diplomacy is changing in this respect, and much of it due to work of people like Andrew Preston. So, Andrew, why don't you take a couple of minutes here, and then let's get some questions from our audience.
Well, I'd actually, you've heard me enough, so I won't. I mean, I thought the comments were fantastic, and I learned a lot from both of them, and there are fair points in the quibbles and the analysis from both Will and Scott, and I'm grateful for that. I never intended the book to be definitive, because no one book is ever definitive, I don't think. Even no matter how long, you try and make it. People think if you make it really long, then you're trying to make it definitive. But I just, the book covers a long period of time, and it does both a top-down and bottom-up approach. And the draft I submitted to my editor, my poor editor, was much, much longer. It would have been, if it were published, it would have been 1,500 pages or so. I mean, it was, and I knew that was too long to publish, but the two of us sort of worked through what to cut, and some of the stuff that I ended up cutting, I now regret cutting, and some of the things I left in, I thought, well, maybe I should have cut that. But I wanted the book to be, where people could either agree with parts of it and build on them, or they could complicate them, or they could say, no, actually, I've got it wrong on this, and then they can offer their own analysis or their own proposals. So this is exactly what I was hoping for the book. The one thing that we might discuss a bit more is Scott's point about causation, or where, at what points in American history did religion become the decisive factor? Did it trump the national interest? Going beyond just building worldviews and that sort of thing. And that's something that perhaps we could discuss as well.
Very good. Yeah. Do we have the other mic? Okay, here we go. This gentleman here, while we're getting the mic to you, let me just mention, on the subject of 700-800-page books, Henry Kissinger wrote a book entitled, modestly, Diplomacy, in 1994, I believe it was, and I think it was exceeded the length of this. It had a 135-page, not that I was counting, index, and the word religion did not appear in that index. So those of us in this field are very grateful for this. Yes, sir. If you would identify yourself, any affiliation, and ask your question. Yeah.
No, I don't think it's on.
There's an on-off switch at the, there you go.
My name is Michael Kimmage, and I teach American history at Catholic University here in D.C. I first want to say that I think Andrew's book is a masterpiece, and it's in a way because of the influence it will have that I want to ask the following question. I think 100 years from now, it will be possible to write a similar book, and religion will be equally important as it is today, as it was in the past, but there'll be a Muslim presence, there'll be a Hindu presence, there'll be a Buddhist presence perhaps, and that leads me to focus on the one thing that I found least satisfying about your book, and this was the non-Christian presence. It was implicit, I think, in one of Scott Flipsy's remarks that this is perhaps a book really about Protestantism in American foreign policy. You were very scrupulous in your research about the presence of Jews in American foreign policy. I felt less the connection between Judaism as a religion and foreign policy than I did about the present sort of Christianity, the content of Christianity in American foreign policy. That's an organic connection. The content of Judaism in American foreign policy I couldn't feel, and I can recognize the challenge and the difficulty of doing that, but I wanted to sort of get some words from you about future scholars, about graduate students, how one can integrate the Christian and the non-Christian elements of this story.
Yeah, that's right. And Mormonism's another one. I don't have a whole lot enough on Mormonism probably. And it's a great question, Michael. I should probably say Michael reviewed the book in the New Republic and gave it a very nice review, but also had some of the same kinds of substantive, thoughtful, what both Will and Scott refer to as quibbles, which are more than quibbles, and I mean that in a good way. That they're thoughtful, incisive critiques and points of analysis that certainly are things that I probably should have considered more. It's a great question about the non-Christian element. You used the word scrupulous. I did try and be scrupulous in bringing in non-Protestant voices. I mean, the story of American religion for a long time is the story of American Protestantism. I think Scott said that at one point in his, and I think we'd all agree on that. What I found, what I argue in my book, is that then when Catholics, Jews, Mormons, other groups end up participating in American political life and public life, despite being in the United States since the earliest colonial days, it's really not until the late 19th and really the post-World War II era when Catholics and Jews become really prominent in public debates, including on foreign policy. As they did, they conformed to a Protestant norm. And they incorporated Protestant ideas about liberty, about individualism, that sort of thing. That doesn't mean that Judaism changed or Catholicism changed, but certainly to some extent, in foreign policy debates, the language of Protestantism, of what Scott called American exceptionalism, quite rightly, that sort of language was used. The problem with American Jews, and certainly in my analysis, well, Jews are there as a sort of a vocal group and a very successful lobbying group in the 19th century, pushing the McKinley and Roosevelt administrations to protest the treatment of Jews in Romania and Russia. Teddy Roosevelt, in his 1904, well, what we now call the State of the Union, what was the annual message to Congress, singled out the Russian government for, for its pogroms and for its violations of, I forget the exact phrase he used, but it was essentially, he was speaking the language of what we would today call universal human rights. And a lot of that came about because of Jewish lobbying efforts. Secretary of State John Hay really took the Romanian government to task over its treatment of Jews. And this is a kind of recurring refrain through the book from the late 19th century up to the famous episode in the 1970s that a number of us have alluded to of Jewish refuseniks and Jackson Vanik and how détente was eventually undermined by this broad-based coalition. Catholics, Jews, Mormons, I argue in the book, used American foreign policy crises and war as a way to sort of enter the mainstream. And a lot of times they did so by supporting wars that they didn't agree with. So I talk about the Mormons in the Spanish-American War who privately thought it was an unnecessary and unjust war, same with American Catholics, and yet publicly they supported it quite vigorously in order to sort of prove their Americanness and prove that they were loyal Americans and that sort of thing. So that's part of the story as well. I mean, I'm sure there are other. It's such a great question, but such an open-ended question. There are a number of ways I could probably take it, but I did try and treat it. But at some point, the story of until very recently, and until the part that Scott identified, until the not just post-World War II, but post-1960s, when it becomes much more fragmented, it becomes, I think, a more difficult story to tell, and I think that's probably what Scott picked up on. Although I think I deal with the post-60s a little better than Scott indicated, but I can see the problems or he was quite right to pick up on the problems that I had with that.
If I could ask you, Andrew, to answer the question your students posed to you about George Bush, and maybe bring this into at least to the Bush-Obama era. And if you like, some of the current debates, which distinctly have not included among our presidential candidates the issue of religion in U.S. foreign policy. Although I did note that the president mentioned religious freedom, I believe, or at least religious toleration in the last of the debates on foreign policy, which was not picked up by the other candidate, Governor Romney. But again, the issue of the continuity as used by American presidents, not only the language but the substance.
That's a great question, Tom, and I deliberately deal with Bush and Obama very briefly in the epilogue, and that was a conscious decision that my editor and I made together. He originally wanted a big full chapter on George W. Bush, and it was still, when I was writing the Bush administration, and it still is today, it was still too close, and I didn't want current debates to overshadow or current emotions and about Iraq or 9/11 or Afghanistan or whatever to overshadow the history, because I wanted the history to sort of stand on its own and it not just be a story of this is only important because of George W. Bush. But I thought this was an important enough story in and of its own right. And in the epilogue, I try and situate Bush and Obama in their very different ways within the tradition that I wrote about in the previous chapters. Now there are people in the room, including to my left and my right, who know a lot more about current policy and the last 15 years than I do. I mean, an infinite amount more than I do. So I'll defer to you. But in Bush, I see it not only in language and not only in a sort of set of values that he promoted, that I also think Obama does, again, in a very different way. But we see it with policy in Africa. We saw it with policy in Africa. We saw it with policy on religious liberty in certain Asian countries, such as Vietnam, where there was a lot of pressure not only from the White House but also Congress, from Democrats as well as Republicans on religious liberty issues. In Vietnam, a country that Scott knows very well, a country that has a very contested, very fraught recent history with the United States, and yet religious liberty was there. Obama rhetorically made religious liberty quite central to his foreign policy. It's there in the Cairo speech. It's there in a sort of town hall meeting that I quote towards the end of the book in China, where he mentioned the importance of religious liberty to democratic politics, and especially religious toleration and religious pluralism. It's very Rawlsian. It's sort of we now think of John Rawls as being more religious than we had often thought, because it turns out that he was. But it's about pluralism and toleration as the essence of democratic politics. His speech in Oslo is essentially a Niebuhrian Christian realism speech, and it was widely acknowledged as such, even though he didn't mention Niebuhr by name. So it's there, and I've been surprised in this campaign at, like you just said, at how not just religious liberty or not just religion in foreign policy, but how religion is kind of, it hasn't been the big issue that I thought it would be in this campaign, domestically or in terms of foreign policy. But who knows what will happen after November?
I'm Gerard Bradley, by the way. Tom Farr has recruited me to tell some jokes, I think, after lunch, but we'll see. But it seems to me that if you think about the Catholic tradition of thought about religious liberty up to Vatican II, it's fair to say that there was something internal to Catholicism that was kind of confounded its thought about freedom of religion, namely that Catholicism understood itself to be the truth about religious matters. And it seems to me there's something like that in Protestantism, or at least American Protestantism, which is that American Protestants thought that Protestantism sort of was religious liberty, that compared to Mormonism, Native American spirituality, Catholicism especially, that Protestants weren't a different kind of religion only, which had interesting and maybe even a substantial commitment to, interesting thoughts and commitment to religious liberty, but that Protestantism was the embodiment of religious liberty. And I wonder if, Andrew, you see, well, if I'm right, or to the extent I'm right, does that confound, or you might say muddy, your attempt to thematize the issue as Protestants promoting religious liberty abroad through American foreign policy? Because, as I say, the Protestantism and religious liberty tend to be the same.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and you know, you're absolutely right. Both Catholics and Protestants for a long time saw their visions as exclusive, or as the ultimate vision of religious liberty or the true faith or whatever. I think that's common to all religions, certainly all world religions. That's what Kant once said. He said, you know, we can't speak of religions logically. There can only be one religion, no matter what religion there is, be it what, you know, there can only be one true religion. There can't be competing true religions. And certainly Catholics and Protestants, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, saw themselves in that light. And so there's an irony of ecumenism and of various ecumenical movements, where ecumenical Protestants in the 19th and 20th centuries until very recently were also extremely anti-Catholic, where Catholic ecumenism felt very uneasy with Protestantism, specifically Anglo-American Protestantism and Geneva Protestantism, and really the coming together of those visions. Well, not coming together, but certainly the cooperative efforts that Scott alluded to in his, or didn't allude to, but mentioned in his comments, is a fairly recent phenomenon. Will has a fantastic chapter in the book, in his book, on Truman's efforts to normalize relations with the Holy See. And to send a U.S. ambassador to the first ever U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, which had been prescribed by Congress. That Congress in 1864, I think, had said, we will never devote any funds to the establishment of official relations to the Vatican. Truman tried to and couldn't because of Protestant opposition, and it's only Reagan who was able to. And in American history, there's been anti-Semitism in American history, but it's dwarfed by anti-Catholicism. I mean, anti-Catholicism was one of the last acceptable prejudices in American public life, and so that the ebbing of that, of not only anti-Semitism but anti-Catholicism from the 1960s onwards, is a remarkable story. nobody's mentioned yet, so we talked about preemption and containment. I'm going to preempt maybe another question. But I talk about Vatican II in the book, but as I was writing it, I realized I wasn't devoting nearly enough attention to Vatican II, which I think is a hugely, hugely important story in American foreign policy, in the global Catholic Church, and in international history. And that's received just a fraction of the attention that it should. And hopefully that's an avenue of future research where people will take that forward.
Very good. We'll continue this discussion when Jerry tells his jokes after lunch, but from my perspective, Vatican II and Dignitatis Humanae did not suggest, and I don't think Jerry was saying this, that the Catholic Church no longer believes that it is the repository of the truth, but precisely that it can promote religious freedom for that reason. So it isn't a kind of indifferentism about what is true that allows the Catholic Church to open itself. So, Jose Casanova.
If I may continue along the same lines, basically comparing the Catholic and Protestant experiences of mission and religious liberty. I mean, one of the paradoxes, of course, is that until the 1800s, there is no evidence of any Protestant global missionizing, when the Catholics had been at it for 200 years. And this being a Jesuit institution, let's remind ourselves that the Jesuits, 20 years after their establishment, were all over the globe. In India, China, Japan, Russia, Ethiopia, in Paraguay, all over North America. And of course, they were struggling precisely with those issues of how claiming to be a universal religion and yet not being cultural imperialists, if you wish. It was Balignano, the great, let's say, strategist in bringing the Jesuits to China that developed the slogan, "Our task is not to Portugalize the Chinese," because they came to Asia, of course, with Portuguese men of war, in Portuguese ship, and with the Portuguese power, imperial power. But they very carefully tried to precisely detach themselves from it. In Latin America, they even tried to establish an alternative to Spanish and Portuguese imperialism in their own Jesuit utopian society. That was half of all of South America in Paraguay. And so it's not religious liberty in the American sense of religious liberty and pluralism, but it's struggling with the questions of how to bring these values of the dignity of human liberty, religious freedom, in a global context that forces us to be culturally sensitive to a different context. So I just want to bring this longer perspective into this kind of conversation to see, I mean, what do you make out of it?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It's a fantastic question, and you're absolutely right that before the 19th century, Protestant efforts at missionizing were paltry and unsuccessful, and in the American colonies, the British colonies in North America, Catholic missionaries were far more successful than Protestant missionaries, and Catholic missionaries even said to themselves that it looks like their heart's not in it, that they're not really putting much commitment to it, and Catholics were much more widespread and had made better efforts. And you use the example of Latin America, but you could think of Matteo Ricci going to China, dressing in Chinese garb, showing a great sensitivity to Chinese culture, not necessarily behaving as we would expect a Catholic missionary in the early modern world to behave. So I certainly take the point. There is a much longer tradition of that. I mean, for my purposes in the book, that story faded away because as I became, as we moved from colonial America to the United States, but even before that, even before the 7 Years' War, Catholicism was fading as a force in the North American colonies, certainly in what would become the United States. And a lot of the ideas of those Jesuit missionaries and other Catholic missionaries didn't have the same kind of cultural purchase with the British colonists who had become, Americans, for lack of a better term. And a lot of the immigrant groups, the Catholic immigrant groups who came through in the 19th century, who then brought large numbers of implanted Catholicism in the United States in a large way, like the Irish or German Catholics, didn't really have a huge presence in the early 19th century in terms of missionary efforts, and certainly in terms of American thinking about the wider world. Excuse me. And so in my book, it's I don't know if it's a limitation, but it's certainly a sad story of my narrative that in the book, the Catholic presence up until the late 19th century is really about anti-Catholicism. And then after that, it's about the incorporation of Catholic ideas. And when Catholics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries begin to speak of spreading religious liberty around the world, and they do so in a, not necessarily in a confessional way, but they do so culturally in a very Protestant way, for the reasons that I alluded to before. I'll just end with a sort of, one of the things I loved about writing this book, and I hope I've brought them out sufficiently in the book, are the contradictions and paradoxes. So scholars like Mark Mazauer and others are now looking at the sort of ironic origins of the UN that we think of as a global community, and when it was set up, it was very idealistic, but he argues that it was set up as a way to perpetuate Western imperialism by another name, sort of Western control over the global South. And I was fascinated by the involvement of the ecumenical movement and missionary organizations, especially in setting up the League of Nations and the United Nations, in the name of a universal community, of a worldwide global community, but doing it from a, sort of at heart, at bottom of, but really the universal basis for this will be our vision of what we think human rights and democracy and so on and so forth should be. And so those paradoxes are often kind of messy, but I sort of loved exploring them in the book, and they're the exact ones that you just mentioned, looking at sort of Catholic missionary history.
Okay, yeah, if I can add a couple thoughts, and Michael, this is in some ways going back to your excellent question, but also picking up on some of the others about the place of Catholics and Jews in this broader narrative, and I'm persuaded that there is a certain Protestant hegemony to the development of American culture. I mean, this is even Sam Huntington's most recent argument. But as I think about Catholics and Jews, the role they play in Andrew's argument and then in some of my own work, it's interesting that two things stand out. One, when Catholics and Jews would occupy places of influence in American foreign policy making in the 20th century, they partly did that by grafting themselves into some of the dominant Protestant narrative and bringing their own flavor to it. But whether it's American exceptionalism or moralism or some of these things that we think of, Henry Morgenthau and his advocacy for the Armenians during the genocide, and later, of course, for European Jews during World War II. James Forrestal as a Catholic. JFK himself, even though he de-emphasized religion, he still buys into this broader sort of civil religious narrative of providentialism in American history. But on the other hand, I also see, just as the Protestants had their own internecine squabbles over what should American foreign policy be and what does Protestantism mean for it, I think the Catholics and Jews did as well. I mean, look at the fierce Catholic debates over Vietnam, for example. What is the Catholic position on Vietnam? Well, some really support it, some oppose it, just as Protestants and just as Jews, too. I mean, there's that famous anecdote of Abraham Joshua Heschel visiting Kissinger when he's National Security Advisor and arguing over what does Judaism say about the American presence in Vietnam. And it's, as our mutual friend Jeremy Suri has pointed out, one can make a good case that Judaism shaped Kissinger's foreign policy more than even Kissinger himself will admit. But here it's what narrative? I mean, for the likes of Morgenthau and Heschel, I think the Jewish narrative is one of liberation, of standing up for the oppressed, of not doing injustice. For Kissinger, the Jewish narrative is more privileging order before justice, and then a sense of the tragic, and a sense of fallibility, and a very strong anti-utopian, anti-millenarian streak. And again, one can point to those same internecine debates within Protestantism as well. So there's a distinctive Jewish and distinctive Catholic flavor there, and yet I think in some ways they're mirroring a lot of the same debates within Protestantism, or what should American foreign policy be.
Just on some of these points, and this is a small one, which I think again dovetails with some of the work that I've done in the past. I do think that Andrew shows that there is a Protestantization of Catholicism, particularly when it comes to issues of war and peace and religious liberty. and I'm thinking about the world, but I think there's also a Catholicization of neo-evangelicals that I think emerges and is, I think, more salient to how neo-evangelicals and Catholics could work together in the new right, particularly not on issues of war and peace necessarily, but on what I call below-the-belt issues, and that's specifically abortion, contraception, gay rights, women's issues, and in particular looking for, I think, intellectual North Stars from which to hang what I think is something that they thought they could head off as their cultural dominance waned. Protestants, particularly neo-evangelicals, Christianity Today, all the sort of famous, sort of neo-evangelical sort of minds, Carl Henry and others, all supported abortion, or at least supported the New York and California laws that were emerging in the 60s, and were in a sense, because I think they believed their dominance would be able to sort of limit the number by, nurturing it within a context of pastoral care and families and, sort of women themselves. But we're shocked to find that after the passage of these laws, it became, the numbers of abortions shot up, to sort of dramatic levels, which I think we haven't seen in America, in California and other places. And so then turned around and looked for ways to sort of think about these type of things, and found within Catholicism a language and allies, which I think led to, sort of them being able to work together on family issues and others. And I think this sort of eventually sort of worked its way out also in their issues, their cooperation on religious liberties, religious freedom issues, and other things as well.
Very good. I'm going to have one more question, and use this to introduce our new project associate, A.J. Nolte. A.J., take it away.
Thanks, Tom. Really appreciated sort of the Spirit Shield of Faith, and sort of dovetails with some of my own long-term interests. One of the more interesting things to me as a grad student of international relations who is also interested in religious issues, I think one of the more interesting relationships that emerged in the past decade or so is the relationship between Rick Warren, a megachurch pastor from California, and Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda. So this idea of an American Protestant pastor directly engaging with another head of state. My question for Andrew is, when you talk about these sort of broad continuities, is this something that is actually unusual, or have we seen other examples where American religious leaders were actually engaging in personal diplomacy and personal foreign policy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very good question. There were instances in which American religious leaders did engage in what we might call personal diplomacy. They certainly met with foreign leaders. There are lots of examples. Obviously, they had to be careful because they could be breaking American law. Sometimes it was they did so in cooperation with the State Department or the White House. A lot of times they were freelancing. A story I tell in the book about Billy Graham in the 80s. Who had done this kind of personal diplomacy with world leaders from the 1950s up through to the 1990s, and Billy Graham was always very careful in what he said, and he was careful on the sorts of claims that he would make on behalf of the United States or about U.S. foreign policy. But he would certainly meet with world leaders. In 1982-83, when Reagan himself was starting to rethink the Cold War, certainly the role of nuclear weapons in the Cold War. But hadn't yet come out publicly with the approach that would lead to the détente with Gorbachev that would end the Cold War. Billy Graham made 2 trips to the Soviet Union in 1982 and 1984 and took a huge amount of criticism from evangelicals at home, from his fellow evangelicals, for going on crusade to the Soviet Union to preach to the Soviet Union, for sort of working with Soviet authorities. When he went to the U.S. Embassy and met with the Siberian Seven, the family of Pentecostals who were who'd been holed up in the U.S. Embassy basement for 5 years as refugees on religious liberty grounds. They berated him. He went to meet with them and thought that it would be a good meeting, and they said, "What are you doing here? What are you actually dealing with the Kremlin for?" But Graham had met with Reagan before, and Reagan wanted Billy Graham to sort of give an impression that he wasn't a warmonger and that the United States didn't want war. And on both of these crusades, especially in 1984, Billy Graham sort of took that message to Kremlin leaders. It was, of course, one of several initiatives that the Reagan administration was pursuing. It wasn't the only story. But that's one of them that I found the most interesting, and certainly in researching. And again, because of the size of the book, it could be a journal article in and of itself, or even a book in and of itself. But I think I have a paragraph or two on it in the book.